All right. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jillian Garman. She is our speaker today. And as many of you know, many of you have been involved in the green infrastructure topic for so long. And our specs and standards subgroup was very diligent about creating the LID Handbook. And I see Lee here and I see Tim. Harry's unfortunately probably not with us today, but I think Rob Hussey is with Flood Control District of Maricopa County. And so there was a lot of time and effort putting into creating that helpful document. And so I was thrilled when Jillian had approached me with regards to her doing her capstone project in doing some research associated with green infrastructure and low impact development throughout the valley, and also how that was working out as far as the LID handbook in kind of moving the conversation forward with LID and green infrastructure on a regional basis. So I was excited for her to do her capstone project. And I told her once she was finished, she had to come and talk to us and tell us what her findings were. And so thank you all for those that agreed to be interviewed and provide feedback to her. I'm sure that was a wonderful asset and very helpful for her to her research process. So without further ado, Jillian is going to be talking to us about her capstone, and the title of her presentation is Assessment of LID Handbook, Integration into Valley Projects and the Impacts of Green Infrastructure and Low Impact Development in the Arid Phoenix Metro region. And Jillian is a recent graduate of the ASU Masters in Public Administration program. So congratulations to Jillian. Yay, exciting. And she's currently a water quality specialist with Wood PLC. Oh, I was going to say, Steve put us on mute. Oh, no. So anyway, I hope I was able to nip that in the bud. Sorry about that. So Jillian currently works as water quality specialist with Wood PLC and completed her bachelor's in geography in 2012 from Augustana College in Illinois. She began her work in a local municipal stormwater program and has since pursued a career in regulatory policy in Illinois, Louisiana, and Arizona. So she's got a lot of background from various regions of the United States. She's got her master's in public administration. And in her personal life, Jillian's an animal lover and avid traveler, which I'm sure that's probably not as easy right now, but she'll be doing a lot of that when COVID is over. And then a self-proclaimed beer aficionado. So you'll have to kind of explain a little bit more about that as well. So with that, Jillian, thank you so much for joining us. Please add to your intro and maybe give folks a bit of background on how you came to want to, research green infrastructure and LID, and how, you got involved with the LID handbook.
Sure. So when I graduated with my undergraduate degree, the stormwater program that I originally started working for, I was just given a blanket internship. It was with the Public Works Department, and I wasn't given any more information past that. So I didn't know anything about green infrastructure or low impact development, but the city that I was working for had a rain garden program. So they had this incentive program. They would reduce residents' water bill if they implanted like a rain garden. But then naturally, you had to have somebody go check and make sure that the rain garden was still there and that it was still functioning. So the town was very hilly. So really the initial reason for it is just to reduce flooding, flash flooding, particularly in the lower parts of the city. And my capstone project for my undergraduate degree was essentially mapping the area to determine which areas were the best places to capture rainwater to reduce the most amount of flooding. So anyway, that's kind of how I got into that internship. So I went to a bunch of different businesses and people's backyards looking at rain gardens, and I just thought that that was just the coolest thing, that you could just plant a garden and it could have these widespread effects for your neighbors and your community. So I started going to a lot more meetings. Iowa has a lot of different programs and a lot of different very passionate people about green infrastructure. So I went to all kinds of lectures and learned a lot more about it. And it's kind of been the reason why I've stuck with stormwater and have worked for different municipalities in a stormwater capacity. So once I got out to Arizona, naturally I was incredibly curious how green infrastructure worked out here, since there's a lot less rain, but a lot more rain in smaller increments. So I sort of was searching around, found the Sustainable Cities Network and all of the really great work that you guys have done. And that's sort of been, what I've been holding on to with the green infrastructure. So my work is more regulatory, and then green infrastructure is more of like a personal passion. So once I had an opportunity in my capstone to do some more research on it, I jumped on it. I thought that the LID Handbook was just like a really awesome resource. And also I just felt like I wasn't seeing as much green infrastructure in the Valley as I was hoping to. So I kind of wanted to find out why. And so I'll start my presentation. Okay. Can you see it? Yeah, okay. My name is Jillian Garman. And like Anne said, this past December, I completed my master's in public administration from Arizona State University. So my capstone project was to help the Sustainable Cities Network and Anne. So the goal for the project was to assess green infrastructure. I've been interested in it since that internship in Rock Island. So Arizona has a huge need for green infrastructure for very different reasons, but also similar reasons. So flooding, water quality, getting green spaces into cityscapes, those are all things that all cities need, but Phoenix has just a very different microclimate. So I sort of wanted to talk to the community. I wanted to look at the different infrastructure that we have in place to sort of see where are we at. I was looking more for a snapshot of where we are right now, rather than necessarily coming up with a list of ways to fix all of our problems. So I was interested in things like, where do we have curb cuts? Who installed rain gardens? Where are we going with it? Where things are, but also how people are feeling about it. Is there a reason why there's not as much, or is it just that it's not as visible and I just don't see it as often? Are there people who are talking more about it in areas that maybe aren't getting traction? Or do people just not know what LID is or green infrastructure? So those are the kinds of questions that sort of jump-started this project. Oh, I don't know why my slide is not. Oh, there we go. So in reviewing literature, anyone who's done any research on green infrastructure or LID specifically in an arid location knows how difficult it is to find what you're looking for. A lot of literature out there is very big picture, lots of sort of umbrella topics. Not exactly the meat and potatoes that you're really looking for when you're, reviewing literature, especially if it's from the lens of wanting to actually implement green infrastructure. So I ran into the same problem. I was doing research, reading articles that were from the Middle East, from Australia, from Israel, and it just really didn't feel very like tactile. It wasn't something that necessarily was helping me understand, this type of plant in your rain garden would work, but this one wouldn't, or actual like real tools to implementing in such a dry environment, rather than just taking something that was originally built for a much wetter climate and adapting it. there's really no literature out there on the best ways to do it, or if there is a different way to do it, something that might work here, but wouldn't work somewhere else that does get more water. So that was really lacking, which was frustrating, not only to me just as a research student, but naturally to the community, to people who are looking, especially municipalities who are looking to implement this kind of thing, but they don't necessarily want to be the first ones figuring it out. If it fails and they've dumped a lot of money into it, it can be a hard sell. So there's really not very much literature out there, though there are some studies. So the City of Phoenix has done several studies about green infrastructure, and really that study with the cost benefit analysis of different kinds of infrastructure, I think there was maybe 4 that they had looked at, was probably the most practical study that I came across. And really it was the outcome of it is that bioretention and swales are the best bang for your buck. And that's over 50 years. So the social and environmental impacts outweigh how much it can cost to implement. So it's kind of a long-term approach, but there's really just not that much more out there. When it comes to actual filtration and water quality, while it's logical to think that if the water is filtering through the soil, that it is getting filtered, there's not really been any conclusive proof that that's happening. Naturally, large particulate matter like soil is going to be filtered out, but anything like phosphates or nutrients or nitrates are not necessarily been proven to be removed from stormwater. Also, green spaces are vital to environmental health in urban areas. So especially here, one of the biggest issues is the urban heat island effect. So more trees is going to reduce how much sun is beating on the pavement and is going to help make things a little cooler. But naturally on a much larger scale, one tree is not going to solve all of our problems. But it is important to start putting, more green spaces into our cities because it helps in the long term. So next slide. So I had a few objectives to my study that both then and now seem like a tall order. So this project was a starting point and an outline for how to continue to build a database of existing features. So my first step was to talk to the community. I wanted to interview and discuss with municipal leaders, SCN participants mostly, a lot of people who are on this call today, and local developers to understand a bit more of the history of green infrastructure in the Valley, as well as how people were feeling about it. So, is it considered a fad? Is it implemented begrudgingly? Was it perhaps more widespread than I was aware? I wanted to know how the LID handbook was being received and if there were opportunities to help it reach the hands of more community members. After those discussions and armed with a lot of helpful tips, I started to assemble the locations of green infrastructure that I knew of and that Anne had provided to me. I took pictures of some of the more prolific sites that we have in the Valley with the hopes of eventually having a photo log of all of the sites in the future. I thought that that would be the most important aspect of this project. In hindsight, I think that the interviews gave me a lot of really great information, but on the outset, I thought that having an actual inventory would be beneficial for anybody who didn't know what green infrastructure was, maybe somebody who wanted to implement it but didn't know what it looked like. So there would be a way for them to actually go see it in person, so that they could see, hey, it's thriving, it's working, it doesn't look like the maintenance is that much. I know the person who owns this, so I can go talk to them about how they implemented it, how they built it, how long it took to establish, that kind of thing. So interviewing was the most time-consuming aspect of the project, largely because my questions were geared to open the conversation up as much as possible. I was speaking with a really wide variety of people, so I wanted the conversation to lead to an honest discussion on what green infrastructure means to people, and what it means to people who live here and who work here. So not surprisingly, most of my questions about physical infrastructure were less fruitful than getting opinions. So these are the questions that I used. I had 2 different sets of questions that were essentially asking the same thing, but my questions for developers were just a little bit different. So, as you can see on this slide, I was asking a lot of hard questions about, how did you implement it? Did you have any problems? Have you had any, benefits that you weren't expecting? And I got a lot of, I'm not sure's. But the last question, if you have any other thoughts about green infrastructure, I got a lot of really great information. It really opened up the conversation, and I was able to talk more about, how they were feeling about it, what their thoughts were. Some people that I spoke with didn't know much about green infrastructure. Some people knew way more than I do. So I learned a lot, and I was able to kind of steer the conversation in whichever way my interviewee seemed to be wanting to take it. So, some people wanted to talk more about the history of green infrastructure and how, the valley has changed and how it's helped or hurt the valley in different ways. Some people wanted to talk more about, just the green infrastructure that was in their municipality, and how it had gotten off the ground, how it was doing. So I sort of let them, rule the conversation. I also included the basics on the LID handbook on this slide, particularly as a reminder to just what it looks like and, the basics of it. But also it's a primer for anyone who's unfamiliar with it. So SCN produced it in late 2019 with the help of a lot of you. It's free on the SCN website. It's a very valuable resource. It's got 10 different specifications of different kinds of green infrastructure. And it's being considered, some of them are being considered in the MAG building standards. So if anybody isn't aware what the LID handbook is, I did speak to some people who didn't know of it or didn't know that it was free. It's a freely available resource. It's on the SCN website, which I'm sure Anne has a link to. So some of the common themes amongst municipalities were the very first suggestion from nearly everybody that I talked to was adaptation of the handbook by MAG. So a lot of municipalities, it's much easier to either get a variance or to allow a developer to have green infrastructure in their plans if the standards are approved by MAG. And the same for developers. It's much easier for them to present their plans to the city if the standards are approved by MAG. So that's really been one of the big hurdles. And so having it be a discussion in MAG right now is a really good thing, but it's also slow moving. So, green infrastructure has been talked about in the Valley for a long time. And for MAG to just currently be looking at the different specs and standards obviously shows how slow moving it can be. So that's kind of the number one frustration that I heard from a lot of people was, that MAG needs to be adopting more of them so that it's a standard practice that anyone could just pick up and implement. So I lost my spot. So then city code was also the second thing that most people were talking about. So many codes are written fairly vaguely, but more in the way of the public interest. So they're not necessarily written to be creative. So for example, city code may have a height of grasses, so that you can only have grass that is a certain height, so that when people are driving, that there's no hazards, that they're able to see all around. And then that means that really you can only have turf. So it's not, the city code is not saying you can only put turf in your yard, but the actual rule saying that grasses can only be so tall really limits what you can actually put in. So city code isn't necessarily written in a way to say green infrastructure isn't allowed, but it is written in a way that can make it difficult to implement green infrastructure. And because you have to get a variance for a lot of different kinds of green infrastructure in order for it to fit, and that can be a long process, a lot of private developers will just take the green infrastructure out because they're on a timeline and they want to make money. So instead of waiting for the variance to go through, they'll just say, well, we'll just take it out. Another issue is that there's not a whole lot of space. So in a downtown situation, any green infrastructure that's being implemented for the most part is going to be a retrofit. So, there's not a whole lot of new construction downtown. And even when there is, it's high-rise buildings that don't necessarily have a lot of space for green infrastructure. Some of these, like bioswales, they need space to be effective. You can't just put a couple of plants in and hope that that is going to be enough to actually absorb the stormwater that is running off of the pavement. So the space issue can be really difficult, especially if you're trying to implement green infrastructure in an area that has a lot of public attention. So if you're looking to do something that is going to be more of like a public outreach, you might want to do that somewhere downtown that has a lot of pavement, but not necessarily a lot of space. So that can be really a big restriction for a lot of municipalities. So another thing that was brought up a lot is that the arguments for green infrastructure are no-brainers. So it's really dry here. The water that we do get should be used for irrigation, for supplemental irrigation. So everybody kind of recognizes that it's good. It's a good conservation practice, but that's still, not necessarily going to change minds, especially when it comes to planning, time, and finances. So even though we all know logically that it's a good practice, it's still difficult to just say, hey, we should do this because it's good for the environment, and then have it be done. So the fifth thing is private interest. So while this isn't mentioned quite as much, I've found that it's the most important aspect of the research project that I did. So much of the land that's here is owned by private people, so by either businesses or residents. And they're really the ones who need to be implementing green infrastructure because they own so much more of the land and they have so much more of the space. So really getting them on board is the most important thing, and it would be the fastest way to implement more green infrastructure. It's a tall order. It's difficult to get people interested in it, especially because it can be complicated and sometimes very expensive. But it is, that's where all the land is. That is probably the most important takeaway. And then the last thing also kind of ties into private interests knowledge. So it can be difficult to find somebody who actually knows how to implement green infrastructure correctly. So bioswales are not necessarily as difficult as, say, porous pavement. Porous pavement, it can be really easy to do it incorrectly. And if you implement it, if you build it incorrectly, it just becomes regular pavement. So it can be hard to find, the right person who knows what they're doing and is actually going to, use this project in a way that is functional. And that's, those also tend to be like porous pavement and permeable pavement can be very expensive. So it can be really quite a risk or a gamble to to hope that the contractor that you've picked knows what they're doing. So then I have a few more common themes. Conservation is one thing that was talked about a lot because we don't get a whole lot of water, that it's important to use what we do get. There's a lot of co-benefits to green infrastructure. So even just the obvious that, you know, it's far prettier than just a regular boring sidewalk and concrete. Also, there's less irrigation. So if you're using it as supplemental irrigation, you have to use less potable water, unless you're talking about the past 12 months where we've gotten like less than 2 inches of rain. So then that doesn't always help, but I mean, it is still something. So then another theme is that right-of-way and jurisdiction can be really complicated. So like I mentioned, there's not a whole lot of space in downtown areas. Retrofitting can be really complex, and it's also a liability. So taking up more of the sidewalk, for example, to put in green infrastructure, you have a lot of other aspects in play. For example, ADA, you know, your sidewalk has to be so big in order to accommodate people with disabilities. Also, you know, if you have a swale and, you know, it has to have a depression in order for the water to accumulate, someone could trip, they could fall. So there's a lot more that goes into planning infrastructure when you're having the public using that same space. So another theme, like I had mentioned, MAG, there's a lot of pressure on them to implement these standards, thinking that it will make it easier and more time efficient to be able to implement green infrastructure. Then the last theme is city engineers. So I have nothing against engineers, and neither do the people that I spoke with. It's sort of a blanket terminology for how sometimes municipalities can be resistant to change. And it's a good thing. Municipalities should be resistant to change. I mean, they are, you know, an institution in our society that shouldn't just be swayed with popular demand. But there should be some change. So change for the better. So that's a hard thing to juggle. You know, making sure that your institution is still upholding, you know, what the public good, but also is willing to sort of bend in some ways to help with, for example, the environment. So city engineers, or, you know, an engineering department, they're more risk adverse and liability adverse, which makes sense considering they're looking out for the public and they're looking out for the public's interests and assets. So because of that, it can be difficult to, especially from an environmentalist perspective, where you just want to be like, this is great for the environment, it's great for the public, why can't you just do it? But you know, it makes more sense to really be planning it. And to think through all of, you know, well, if we put this in, what will happen? What could happen? So it's just kind of like a hard hurdle to jump. And then also there are some instances where some engineers just don't know very much about the environment or environmental studies in general, which makes sense. That's not what they study. So it can be difficult if they don't quite understand the effects or the reasons for it. So there can be a little bit of resistance there. So then here I have some pictures that I took. So these are just some examples of bioswales and curb cuts. These three, the Mesa Urban Garden, ASU Downtown Taylor Mall, and Glendale Park and Ride. These are three of the most commonly cited infrastructure, green infrastructure. And all of them are doing really well. As you can see in these pictures, they're really beautiful. They're healthy, they're functional. So the Glendale Park and Ride has these swales around it. It's also got porous pavement. And, you know, lots of trees, lots of grasses. ASU downtown also has some pavers, some permeable pavers. These are bioswales here with curb cuts to this street. I think it's Taylor Street. And then the Mesa Urban Garden is looking fantastic with all those beautiful flowers. And this actually picture was taken during a rain event. I didn't take this particular picture, but as you can see, the water is flowing perfectly from the street right into the bioswale. So these are permeable pavers and porous concrete. So these are all functioning really well. I've heard there's lots of sentiment in the area that permeable pavers and porous concrete, that it might not work out here because of how much dust we have. And that, you know, it can fill up all of the space in the concrete and make it so that, you know, it can't absorb water. But from every municipality that I've talked to that actually has and maintains permeable pavers and porous concrete, that's not the case. They drain really exceedingly well. And they haven't really had any problems with it, with maintenance, upkeep, or not having adequate filtration. So they do really well. I would be interested to see, especially with this Taylor Street mall, what the, because it's a parking space, whether there is any filtration of like those oils and stuff that are coming off of the vehicles. But as far as I know, there's not been any research into that. So this talks a little bit about curb cuts. Curb cuts, in my opinion, are some of the easiest green infrastructure to implement. There can be some issues with like right-of-way and traffic issues with curb cuts. But as far as I know, there have not been very many problems with it. So the biggest issue is making sure that on the other side of that curb cut, that the ground is low enough for the water to actually go in. So that can be a problem. Sometimes the water flowing into the curb cut and then right back out. And you know, the more sediment that is accumulating in there, it's sort of growing in the elevation. So it needs a lot of maintenance of actually cleaning out trash and debris and sediment, but it is a pretty easy thing to implement. So in this upper left corner, this is Manzanita Park. This is right down the street from where I live. They have curb cuts all over the park, and it just drains right into a big retention area. And there's not even really a whole lot of plants there. There's not a whole lot of maintenance. It's mostly rock, but it functions really well. And it takes all of the surrounding areas drainage and it holds the water, and there's really not very much flooding. So they're pretty effective. So then this last slide, this was the map that I produced. It's kind of hard to see because it's on such a large scale. But these are the different areas that have green infrastructure. So I can't even read what all of these are. It's too small on my screen. But as you can see, there's a lot that are kind of centered in downtown Phoenix, but they're pretty evenly spread out amongst municipalities. I would say, you know, most cities seem to have at least a handful of green infrastructure. A lot of cities have green infrastructure that have, you know, plaques and, you know, public education on it. Not necessarily like, you know, classes or anything like that, lectures or anything. But there is a lot of municipalities that have sort of, you know, a little explanation of, you know, what this rain garden is, what it does, what the purpose is. So these are the places that I found. If there's any that aren't on these maps, I would love for, you know, anyone to put them in the comment section. I think that this is still a really important resource to have, so that, you know, we know where this stuff is. Even if it's something that, you know, you've just driven by. Some of these I just drove by and saw them, you know, it's on a private property. And so I just logged them because, you know, I think it's important to keep track of them so we can make sure that they're, you know, functioning, that they're maintaining, that we can learn from them if they're failing or even if they're, you know, succeeding and doing really well. So I would say that basically the main takeaway from my research was that there's a lot of interest in green infrastructure. There's a lot of people who are passionate about it, who recognize that there is a big need for it. It's just that there's, some regulations that are really hard to get around. And some of our institutions are moving pretty slowly. So rather than just continuing to slog through, I think that the best way to get more green infrastructure quicker is to pivot towards private land and to have more outreach towards the public. I think that putting more time and resources into teaching the public what green infrastructure is, easy ways that they can implement it on their own lawns, and really helping them understand how to take care of it and how important it is to keep rainwater on their site and on their land, is the quickest and the most beneficial way to increase the amount of green infrastructure that we have in the valley. And I think that's about it. So does anyone have any questions?
Thank you so much, Jillian.